We'll get started in a few minutes. My name is Steve Horst, and I'm the Regional Sales Director for Watchful Software. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us this morning. We believe you'll find the information beneficial and useful. Once again, my name is Steve Horst. I'm the Regional Sales Director with Watchful. Just a little bit about Watchful Software, the company. We're a spinoff from Critical Software, which is a Portuguese software development company. We are probably the fourth or fifth company to be born out of Critical Software. We have our headquarters in New York City. We have a global sales organization. We have customers around the globe. And we're here today with Sphere, which is our preferred partner who is sponsoring the webinar with us this morning. Having a little trouble changing the slides. Okay, there we go. A little bit about what we do. We help organizations to control and protect their sensitive and confidential information and to protect against information leakage by applying a company's defined information control policy to all types of unstructured information. To successfully implement a policy-driven classification process, most organizations need to answer the following questions. What data is truly sensitive? Who should have access to it? How is the data to be handled? When should the classification change? And where should the data be protected? We allow information to be classified as it's saved in the case of documents, spreadsheets, and presentations, and as it is sent in the case of messages and emails. We help to dynamically enforce an organization's information security control policy on all types of unstructured data at the point it's created and legacy data as well. It's a seamless integration into a user's normal daily tasks and workflow. We also make DLP solutions better. How do we do that? Well, we help you maximize the investment that you already made on your DLP solution. We do that with dynamic classification, tagging, labeling, and watermarking of your sensitive data. It helps you save time and money by reducing false positives. So there's a tangible ROI to that. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to Patrick Fields. There's my contact information if you'd like to learn more about Watchful Software. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much for that introduction to Watchful Software.
You should be the presenter.
Yes, I am the presenter now, so thank you very much for passing that over. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you happen to be joining us from the world today. My name is Patrick Fields, and I'm a Senior Account Manager with Sphere Technology Solutions. And what I'd like to do today is just introduce you to Sphere, who we are, what we do, and give you a little insight into how we do it. So who is Sphere Technology Solutions? We are a solutions provider focused on improving security and enhancing compliance for our customers. What we do is we produce analytics to identify risk within our client's organization. We then utilize those analytics to craft a plan to remediate those identified risks. We then execute on that remediation plan to improve security, enhance compliance, and reduce risk within the environment. And then we deploy a level of automation for the environment to prevent the reoccurrence of those risks. I believe that we're in a great market space. As you notice here from this slide, we're a very fast-growing company, and we've been very, very fortunate to win some awards and be recognized for the hard work that we perform for our clients. Our service offering has three pillars. Those pillars are specialized professional services. This is the consulting, the work that we do for our customers to produce the enhanced security and the improved compliance outcomes that they're seeking. We perform this work using strategic software. These are the tools that we rely on to identify and remediate risk within our customers' environments. This is a combination of third-party technologies such as Watchful Software RightsWatch and our own intellectual property that we bring into a customer's environment. In an instance where you may not possess some of these tools, we can help you with the acquisition of these technologies by acting as your value-added reseller. The third pillar of our service offering is customized integration. This is the marriage of people, processes, and technology that our clients require to maintain the governance model for their environment. So what do? Let's go a little deeper. If you take a look here, you're looking at data, systems, and access, three very fundamental components of a typical technology infrastructure. Data is the information that you use every single day in your business, starting from the line worker, through the middle manager, all the way up to the C-suite. Systems are the places where that data lives. And we're talking about anything from an unstructured repository, such as a file share or a SharePoint site, to more structured places, such as a database or an application. And then access. Who has access to this information, and who should have access to this information? Now, all that looks rather simple, but then you really have to consider, how do I secure these critical assets from internal and external threats? What are the compliance guidelines that I have to manage these assets according to? These could be external regulatory requirements, internally developed audit policies. And then what is the governance model that a company needs to employ to maintain security for the environment and to fall within the necessary compliance guidelines? So what does Sphere do to assist customers with enhancing and deploying that governance model? We utilize a four-phase methodology. We begin by assessing a target environment, develop the KPIs, understand that environment at a high level of detail, identify where the risk exists within the environment. We then utilize those metrics to create a plan that will reduce risk. We then perform the remediation. That's the execution of the plan to reduce risk. And then we deliver a level of automation around the environment so that those risks will not return to your organization. So how do we do this? We begin, as I said before, with the assessment. We collect a tremendous amount of metadata from your environment utilizing third-party tools. We may access a particular target directly, or as I mentioned before, we do utilize some of our own intellectual property, as you see here in the case of the Sphere collectors, to enhance the level of information that we can obtain from a target either directly or a third-party tool. We then process this information to deliver the KPIs that are necessary to provide an understanding of the environment and identify where the risk occurs. This business intelligence is a combination comes from three key places. It's industry best practices. It's our own internally developed business intelligence, our best practices that we've developed over the years of performing this work for many, many customers. And then lastly, and as equally important, it is the KPIs and the business intelligence that our customers want to run their business according to. We present all this information out to the customer, and this is where you start to see how things change as you engage in our four-phase methodology. The assessment is kind of the dipstick, if you will. It's a measurement of where you sit today. The plan is now what you're going to do to improve the environment, to create that target operating model. The remediation is where you start to see the KPIs improving. You start to see the risk ratings being reduced. And then automation is the piece where we've tied together the people, the processes, and the technology to have risk reduction as a business as usual activity. Now, I'm sure you have a few questions at this point, so I just want to share with you my contact information. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Vijay Viswanathan so that he can give us his perspective on security, risk, and compliance from the CISO's point of view.
Thanks, Steve. Just doing a quick check here. Hopefully you can hear my voice loud and clear.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen on my end. Please confirm you can see my screen.
Vijay, we don't see your screen yet.
Nope,
now we have it.
Great, okay. All right, let's get started. A really quick introduction from my side here. Take this out of the way there, great. I'm Vijay Viswanathan. I got about 17 plus years of experience in technology, cybersecurity, privacy, compliance, and risk management areas. Primary focus is in the past couple of years has been more in the cloud, data security, and understanding the next thought process around how do we address the shifting context. I do also, I'm a part of quite a bit of advisory boards, and I do advise venture capital firms, startup organizations, and I'm guilty of charge for creating the Twitter handle and making follow the data similar to follow the money, Cuba Gooding Jr., all wild out there. To get started today, folks, what I've done is the agenda, the pieces that we're going to touch today is understand what the shifting context is, what are the drivers for better DLP. We're also going to talk a little bit about why is data all the more relevant today than ever before. Then a brief introduction on a DLP and my perspectives and experiences and what has happened at my organization and organization that I've advised on. We'll touch on some digital transformation concepts, and finally, I will leave you guys with a little bit of considerations if you're pursuing DLP in your pathway. To start with shifting context, let's kind of break it down. In the past, what typically happened, if you look at the IT landscape, we had data centers, host servers, typically company assets, fixed perimeter, everything was well organized within the boxes. The reason why it happened are from a security perspective or risk management perspective, the primary focus was always device-based controls, and it was rather easy to implement, one-dimensional, and of course, the attack started getting sophisticated and these controls didn't make sense. What's happening right now is we are seeing a major shift. Obviously, with virtualization being the key driver, there's quite a bit of cost out opportunities driving this game where data centers are no longer relevant. Now, this doesn't mean data centers are gone. All it means is a very classic example, cloud is not something nebulous, it's somebody else's computer where we are putting our data in. I think that summarized, this was in one of the conversations at RSA recently, with the evolving perimeter and the reduction of data center focus from an IT perspective, the entire focus model is more towards the cloud infrastructure and more importantly, data. In other words, IT teams are beginning to focus more and more on the data aspects of governance rather than managing the physical devices and the physical parameters around layer 3 and layer 7 focus points. And why is this happening? Most CIOs, CISOs, and even CEOs are beginning to get into what's called as the digital transformation, or in other words, they're revisiting the digital operate more effectively in the shifting context of business today. So the key thing that's likely to happen more and more, and we're going to be hearing about this quite often, is digital transformation. And to summarize the long and short of it, the way I see it, more data is more problems. So what do we typically do about it? There are a couple of context scenarios we can approach, some risk strategies that are on the table that we can take a look at. But primarily, the takeaway from this particular visual here is business operations have transformed and consumption has evolved. BYOD devices are in the mix. Your perimeter assumptions are no longer saying access to the right data at the right time at business speed is more important than the available. So with this as a kind of drill down into why the focus is more data rather than the physical perimeter, and let's connect the dots and seeing what a typical DLP control can really solve the problem for us. Now the Debbie Downer of the situation, right? We have the regulations landscape, obviously across the world. There are different regulatory requirements from a PII perspective, the financial perspective, and healthcare may be your core business area. Very relevant if you're considering a DLP path or a path to control and traffic your data, in other words. The key reason for that is most organizations that have failed in DLP implementation have missed a key point. They haven't mapped the solution appropriately between the type of business operations that they do and the type of solutions that they're bringing into the table. Down the road, I'm going to talk about attack cycle looks like and why it is absolutely critical to understand the attack vectors within your organization before you go ahead and pick up a DLP solution or a similar type of approach. Long and short of it, I'm going to touch a little bit today on PCI DSS controls. We also can talk a little bit more about the state security breach laws that are constantly evolving breach that happens. And the reason why solutions like DLP are becoming more relevant as regulatory landscape will become more clear as the concept of infrastructure management keeps disappearing. Now, let's define data loss with a common syntax or taxonomy so we understand what exactly we're talking about. This is from the NIST framework. Data loss leak prevention solution is designed to detect potential data breach, primarily data exfiltration during transmission. It's pretty common knowledge that anytime a DLP is associated, we immediately jump into the standard classification of data in motion and data at rest. The key question for us to consider as we keep thinking about cloud-based digital transformation initiated organization is looking at DLP, are these classifications still relevant? This is the fundamentals of, when you consider data security, this is always us. You protect the data at rest, you protect the data in motion. Are there other scenarios during your data life cycle where we need to start considering better controls? The easiest way to answer the question, or at least from my perspective, based on the past 4 years of implementing these type of solutions, define your data life cycle within the organization. If you're able to pinpoint the HVTs, high value targets within the organization, and have a clear sense of where your data is actually coming in and going out and where it's actually getting processed, you are going to see quite a few areas. Granted, there are going to be subtopics of data at rest and data in motion. You're going to see some very interesting perspectives. Let's drill down a little bit further here. I kind of jump right into the mud here, so to speak. These are some of the lessons learned in one of my previous implementations. And typically what happens with these situations is this is often overlooked, not necessarily forgotten. Let's take an example here with misconfigured port span or taps in the network area. Now, one of the key things that you want to do when you're considering a DLP solution, and especially if you're talking the physical layer DLP solution, is to understand the scope and the nature of how data is transferring across your network. The easiest way to do this is get in line with one of your key devices, similar to how you would approach it for your IDS IPS solution, and get a sense of what's really going back and forth. Now, what we did through as we implemented the first generation of DLP solutions, we did not actually effectively configure the network segments, and the way we looked at our inline controls, we only looked at it from a data center perspective and not from a branch perspective. What typically happens after this is when you implement a solution, your configurations are not optimal enough and you're missing quite a bit of data. Of course, we rectified it when we realized that the problem is stemming out of you're only focused on the data center, assuming your network is designed in such a fashion, and you're not essentially tapping into what's happening at the branch level routers. The second key point that is often overlooked, and this is something we got right when we implemented it, is encryption of data. So typically, you want to hit DLP controls before the data gets encrypted. Unlike SSL layer interception, SSL traffic interception using products like Zscaler or any one of those proxies, intercepting DLP controls is feasible, but the error rate seems to be pretty high. So you want to apply your DLP controls prior to data getting encrypted. Now, the other area that I've seen in larger organizations especially is discovery network scans. So what happens is there is a typical myth that when you have sensitive data in a location, you want to treat it as gold and you really are not focused on scanning that area. In other words, you're getting so concerned about the data, you're not actually scanning the sensitive areas of your environment. Get a better governance control model, and we experienced this problem with a couple of our ERP solutions. We also experienced this problem with our Exchange platform mail services. So the best way to address this is get the stakeholders before you go about implementing your DLP program and kind of get a good sense of what is the rhythm for you to complete your data lifecycle scans. Now, data lifecycle scans is a term I'm introducing, so you get a better understanding of this is not implemented once and forget it. There needs to be a constant fueling of the patterns of data lifecycle within your organization as and when you procure, let's say, for example, a new based solution. Let's make up an example here. Let's go ahead and procure Salesforce. The activity that you perform at Salesforce from within the organization and outside the organization changes the data lifecycle or the data lifecycle DNA of your organization. So a fundamental central point where you're able to connect the dots of evolving data lifecycle is very crucial for anyone to have a solid DLP control and in fact leverage the control to prevent data exfiltration. Finally, another example, there's tons of examples, but these are the key ones that I thought I would share today, was the network versus endpoint discovery scans. Typically, scans can be configured, from an IP perspective or from an endpoint perspective. Something that we realized during implementation or halfway through the implementation, based on the type of controls or the product that you're chosen, DLP does have a certain operational cost if you're going on a device-based or endpoint-based security control. Now, if you're considering a DLP solution that's purely data-driven from the cloud and it's dynamic in nature, this may not play such a big factor, but if you're a larger organization, you do want to consider the age of the devices that you have predominantly and the type of cost of operations. In other words, is there a system slowdown? Are you going to see a difference in your user process? Are you impacting other governing policies? For example, we do have NAC, Network Access Control, across our domain. And one of the challenges we faced was ensuring the interrogation piece and the DLP piece doesn't conflict with each other, but actually complements one another. So considerations of that sort is absolutely critical before you move into the DLP realm. Now, let me kind of summarize some key thoughts on what I call DLP housekeeping, whether you are choosing a product in-house in the cloud, whether you're approaching it from a layer 3 or a layer 7, or purely from a data perspective. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're considering in-motion. Understand your SSL roadmap of the organization. In other words, most organizations today with the right-minded CISO will probably have an SSL strategy. SSL is just not implementing a certificate for your, a web services, but essentially picking up a PKI architecture that works for both device authorization, device authentication. You could literally spin a security layer purely with the PKI model. Now, when you define that, understand where transparency is needed from a DLP perspective, and you would need to intercept your own SSL controls. In other words, trusted attacks are absolutely possible if the SSL controls are not implemented correctly when you have DLP in place. Encryption. Transparent data encryption is absolutely key. If not, you're going to have a beautiful DLP product that really doesn't saturate with enough information since you're not intercepting effectively, or B, you're over-intercepting and creating trusted attack models. Auditing has been one of the best lessons learned, at least from my perspective, and I look at the effectiveness of DLP, going through 4 generations of DLP at the moment. As with every audit, these are quarterly audits that I've been doing along with my staff, and each of this audit has given an insane amount of insights that actually help us connect the dots back to our security intelligence dashboard, which is basically a big data platform. There's a lot of value in defining the right audit cycle for DLP implementation. The most critical of all is information management policies. Now, this kind of dictates or preempts everything else, in my opinion, unless you have a clear data classification as part of your data lifecycle within the organization. The chances of DLP project hitting the success level is pretty low. Data classification should be the fundamental rudimentary step before you approach any type of complicated DLP set. Now, when you look at modern solutions, you do have dynamic data classification capabilities, which essentially scans or interprets the data and tells you that there is PII within that particular transaction, and you're able to filter it likewise. One of the key examples I'll point out here, especially with spam attacks, the advent of Locky, the primary attack vector for these type of attacks are, of course, email. And email is one of the first places you can start to implement a DLP control that actually will resolve quite a bit of problem. This is a high damage area. And if you have the right type of solution with the right DLP rules, sensitized for your environment based on your associate, clarity of education that they have around spam, you're going to see the best mileage. So in Gen 3 implementation of DLP controls within our organization, Gen 1 and Gen 2 primarily focused on device-based controls. The Gen 3, I primarily shifted the target towards email-based DLP controls, which actually resulted in a dramatic drop in threat levels. And a very simple exercise here. Anytime you do filter a particular email and you scan the DLP data, or your DLP controls are scanning and identifying data, instead of just blocking the email, actually send an email back to the user, telling them why you blocked the email, and walk through your company policy. Now, this has been the best exercise that we have put in place that has yielded better behavior from our associates. Anytime we block information, we teach them right away. This is almost equivalent to security as a self-service. When they receive an email, they get a link. We tell them about the latest hacks and threats, and then connect the dots for them to get a better understanding. Access controls. Access controls, this is a very interesting area. You can look at information rights management. You can also look at data loss prevention controls. The strategies of implementation are, they start at a similar layer, but the type of controls are different. In other words, you can achieve prevention of data exfiltration with both the strategies. But based on the appetite within the organization and the maturity of your identity and access management roadmap, you could pursue the rights management approach or complement your DLP with rights management, which is a lot more beneficial, which is where I'm focused primarily in the next generation of DLP deployment. When you consider the at-risk scenarios, a couple of key things comes to mind. One is operating system and apps need to be absolutely patched. This is the fundamentals 101, no questions asked. Endpoint security tools are both a boon and a bane. And what I mean by that is, if you look at organizations like Netflix, they're actually walking away from an endpoint thinking. The modern endpoint solutions, not to name the brands, but if you look at the crowdsourced solutions or microsegmentation solutions, the evolution of these solutions are very different. So these play a critical dynamic in what type of solutions you're picking up from a DLP perspective. And I would highly encourage considering a thought process which is data-driven rather than device-driven based on the industry vertical that you're focused in. Firewall configuration seems to have the biggest impact with most of our DLP implementation, and rule mapping, ensuring that the policy that you have on paper is actually translated to the right security control at your firewall, and mapping that firewall control effectively as a DLP policy is an art in itself. So the more you saturate your firewall, ensure that there is a lifecycle process in place that I spoke about in the previous slide to ensure your DLP controls are updated as well on a regular basis. Always have access from a need-to-know basis and not from it's nice-to-have basis. This solves a lot of the problem, and need-to-know defines your data classification within the organization as well. The final point, of course, is monitor only what matters. There is no point, filling up the SIM tools and security intelligence tools if you could actually do some preemptive work before the data comes into those, big data entities. Let's kind of bridge the gap between the DLP lifecycle that we have spoken so far and why it becomes very interesting from a typical attack cycle today. Most attack cycles, now this is not designed to go comprehensively tell you how an attack cycle exists today, but most attack cycles based on reasonable research kind of lends into this. Obviously, there's an initial recon of your targets. If your monitors are optimized, you can effectively see the reconnaissance process. And if you pattern your behavior, network behavior over a period of time, it's quite easy to pinpoint where the attack patterns are coming from. So take those reconnaissance attacks, the simple scan attacks seriously. Pay attention to understand the frequency, especially the country of origin, and also try to figure out exactly how or why the attack cycles are happening against target IPs. And if the target IPs are well-established or well-known transaction servers, or for example, e-commerce servers, it's a no-brainer why recon is happening. Now, the next typical step is point of entry through social engineering, malware injection. If you look through all the data breaches that we have seen in the past couple of years, hacking isn't necessarily, as you all know, 100% of the time technical at all. So most of the social engineered hacks have higher success rate. So that would be the second step. The third step is command and control, and looking at point of sale terminal based attacks, especially in the transaction industry like ours. What we tend to observe is the third step becomes the ultimate point. Gaining entry, of course, is critical, but the third step, command and control establishment and validation that it exists, is the critical piece. This is where the actual silence period starts happening. It's not necessary that the data starts getting exfiltrated right away. Assume that you have the right DLP life cycle. If you missed the first and the second objectives in this attack life cycle, you would probably see the command and control communication if your controls are right. The next topic, of course, is the thought process would be the lateral movement, figuring out what would be the right data spot, what are my key sensitive data within the organization, and figure out what's important for the attacker to monetize from it. End of the day, asset and data discovery leads to finally the most critical step, data exfiltration or ransom based on the type of attack. Now, this particular data exfiltration piece that we're talking here directly correlates to the DLP lifecycle process that we spoke about so far. In other words, all through the attack cycle, your primary focus has always been to prevent a data breach, to prevent an attack. But if you start assuming the attack has already happened, then your mind shift actually goes more towards how do I understand what data is going out. It's not just important to pen test from outside, but it's critical to pen test from inside out as well. So the thought process here is, if you focus your data strategy on data exfiltration models, you will have a better understanding and articulation of where to head to rather than trying to understand where the attack is coming from. Obviously, to achieve this type of a data-driven security model, certain things have to change in your core security program, or at least the state of thinking has to evolve. The typical practice has always been baseline patch and control. You perform large-scale scans, and then you perform your perimeter protection, the standard approach of reacting to breaking news, and of course, you always have a list of things to get done all the time. Now, consider moving into a detect, analyze, and fix model, and essentially what you're going to get down to is you kind of start identifying your high-value assets across the organization. High-value assets are the ones that the hackers are really behind. These are the money makers, the breadwinners, the core systems within your network. The second piece, understand the data lifecycle within the core piece here. In other words, go ahead and figure out the key data lifecycle patterns for your HVT. The next step, of course, is harden and patch your core systems and pattern everything. Understand your network traffic flow inside out so you have a clear understanding of, today is Wednesday and we're considering at 11 o'clock, what should be the typical network pattern be, and what else you need to do from a perspective of, if there is a deviation to the core network pattern, then there is something wrong within the network. So when you get to that state of security intelligence, DLP controls actually complement the thinking very well. Obviously, understand the good days versus attack days. So you're not reacting all the time, but you're getting proactive about your thinking. Finally, start predicting and don't store everything with the belief that you would be able to retroactively go and figure out what's going on. Now, prediction-based models are something, it takes time, but what you could do with your right DLP control or the right DLP model will actually complement in getting to the prediction model. So solve problem with meaningful data controls. This is my experience, or at least the 3 lifecycle experiences that I've gone through. If these key aspects are not well defined with the key stakeholders across the organization, both the business as well as the technology stakeholders, the success rate of DLP, or for that matter, any security controls, are going to be challenging. You want to have accurate data definitions of everything within the organization. You want to make sure that the key requirements and the solutions are aligned. You want to look at a DLP solution that integrates with different platforms effectively. Primarily, I've seen some challenges with Mac operating system or Apple-based system not integrating very well, especially if you're looking at solutions that are endpoint driven. But if it's a database solution, you should not have any problem. Figure out how are you going to predict the problems, how are you going to right-size the solutions for those problems that you have actually predicted. Your thought process needs to be relevant, as in if the CEO and the CIO is trying to move towards a digital transformation, you want to be able to map it back to that relevant thinking in order to deliver effectively against the organization's requirement. Finally, customization of DLP controls is something absolutely crucial. Data exchanges, as new cloud-based solution keeps coming in, as new approaches of solving problem comes in, you want to have flexibility and you want to start focusing at the data layer more and more than the actual physical device itself. And the last point is time to respond. Do the controls in your organization, the way you have implemented them, do they offer you in-time response, or does it take X amount of time to go configure the data, understand the data, and then figure out how to respond to the problem? That's a very critical perspective. Now, all said and done, how do I kind of compress all this into one page and figure out how do I build a solution, a security framework, so to speak, that actually works, that actually can deliver something. The thought process is start with data classification. This is the fundamental step one. Step two, understand the organization's digital transformation strategy and where are the key connectors in the strategy for your DLP thought process. Connecting back to housekeeping, get the basics done. As I spoke earlier, very simple housekeeping changes from business organization to business organization, but the fundamentals almost remain the same all the time. Figure out an identity strategy. What is your identity and identity management program look like? Does it use a lot more PKI? Does it still use passwords, the two factors of the world? What is your identity strategy and how are applications protected? Figure out how this identity strategy integrates to your authentication and authorization model, and how does these two aspects play into your DLP layering. Now, context-aware controls are absolutely crucial as we get more unstructured data from resources that are not hosted within our data center. You want to get context ready and context aware. In other words, you are on a web page with sensitive data with no SSL, then the solution should be able to pinpoint and prompt the user you are in an unsafe zone. Consider those thought process before you actually even procure a solution. Right-sizing it to your organization always makes the thought process and the implementation flow much better. The final piece of it is continuous user education. Educate all the time. Create awareness campaigns all the time. And the more your associates understand what each of your security tools does, the better is the success rate for your DLP program. And in closing, here are some considerations that has worked for me. It's out of lessons learned again. Always start small with a few simple policies. Don't over-architect your core DLP policies from day one. It doesn't work. Key point to remember is this is risk reduction, not risk elimination. There is always another loophole in the organization that we need to go and fix. So start a very pragmatic approach to reducing the risk surface versus risk elimination. And the best way to do it is grow the deployments over multiple generations, and your success rate becomes better. You also gain a lot more confidence as you grow from face to face, and you can control the product the way you like it and for the best implementation possible. The next piece, of course, is start with monitoring, alerting, and associate education. I can't emphasize the importance of integrating your monitoring and alerting piece back to a central dashboard or a single pane of glass so that you can act on it. Your SOC teams can respond to it and react to it effectively. With that said, the one important and the last point on the page here is when you add new policies, always test first with a limited audience. This is absolutely crucial, even though you may have a global policy and list of controls. Validating DLP controls, small sizing it, ensuring that it works as you scale is very, very relevant and important. With that said, Steve, can we open it up for questions?
Sure, I'd like to open it up. Thank you, Vijay, for that insightful presentation. We'll open it up for questions. If you have any questions, you can, I believe, type it into the question box, and then we'll answer them. We'll give you a minute to type in any questions. Patrick, do you see any questions?
Yes, Steve, thank you. I did receive a couple questions. First one was, how does my organization implement a data classification program? And I'd like to start by answering that and then turn it over to Vijay. From the perspective of a solutions provider, we echo pretty closely what Vijay said. Start small and start in an area where you can make an impact. One of the first things that we do for a customer is we want to dive deep and understand the use case of the data, understand who the data owners are and the data stewards. So we're understanding the criticality of the data, but we're also understanding the business needs for access and utilization of that data. And then from there, we can begin implementing controls around that data, get some wins for the customer, and then we use that to broadcast that out throughout the broader organization to help the security organization, roll this program out enterprise-wide. Vijay, I think you have probably some comments to add on that based on the slides you shared today.
Absolutely. I would definitely echo on your thought process on getting the fundamentals right. As I kind of pointed out during the discussion earlier, data classification is not a security organization problem. Data classification is a business problem. Any business today most definitely leverages data to the maximum extent. Data analytics is the key. It's a competitive advantage. So ensure that your data classification doesn't stem from your DLP project's requirement. Ensure that the data classification actually is already in place, or facilitate that first with the technology groups and the business group, along with your general counsel, your legal team, before you embark on the DLP feature to get the maximum efficiency for implementation. The success rate is probably going to be much higher if the security teams don't own data classification.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next question that came in, very good question. What role do you think reducing the data you hold plays in reducing overall exposure? This is related to one of the key components of the EU General Data Protection Regulations. At Sphere, we believe that overall data reduction is absolutely critical to reducing risk. One of the KPIs that we often produce for customers is an analysis of stale versus active data. And in many cases, you can immediately reduce risk just by reducing the amount of stale data you have. Vijay, do you have anything to add? I'm sure you've probably got some experience in that in your organization.
Absolutely. I think to continue on your thought process on stale data, before you embark on this data lifecycle concept that I was talking about, understanding the data lifecycle within your organization, as you develop your data classification standards, the most critical piece to associate with that is your data retention standards. With data retention, you're essentially defining the longevity of data that needs to reside. The worst problem to have is having too much of data in hand that's doing nothing but eating up your storage space and not really delivering any value. The term I like to use within my organization is digital hoarding. So the more data you hoard, not only are you actually taking up a lot of the space, but you're creating additional exposure points from a regulatory perspective when data is not needed. So what do you do about this? Data retention needs to be an enforceable policy within your organization from key system, and deletion is the only way to go ahead and enable that particular piece. Data destruction needs to be an active component in your life cycle. The less the data footprint, the more you can focus on data in motion rather than data at rest, which is where the real meat is for a data exfiltration.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you very much. Next question, please describe how a specific document is classified, tagged, and how does that follow the life of that document? I'd like to start that and then hand that over to Steve. One of the key ways that Sphere attacks this challenge is a two-phase approach. We first want to use a solution to scan data to identify markers that would indicate it's a document covered by, say, PII policy, PCI policy, many of the other alphabet soup of regulation out there. But then we want to be able to enhance that and take it one step further by getting the business involved, by adding a tag or a watermark or a piece of metadata that can live with that document throughout its entire life cycle. And this is the piece where Rights Watch gets involved. And Stephen, I think you could share quite a bit more about that.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. Yes, documents can be classified dynamically based on the policies that you set up in the admin of the solution of RightsWatch. What we've seen with most of our customers is, and I think Vijay mentioned this as well, they take an approach to the crawl, walk, run, where they start out basically just classifying their data and not really doing enforcement at first. So the first step would be doing the classification, and then they do the enforcement, and then they do because of the labeling and the tagging, integrating it with their DLP. One of the parts of your question was, is it encapsulated? It can be encrypted a couple different ways. I mean, you can use an external product because we tag it. We can encrypt based on certain tags. We also work with Microsoft Rights Management as well. Hope that answers your question.
Great. No, Steve, that was very informative. Thank you. Next question we have is, how does this product integrate with Symantec data loss prevention? Excellent question. At Sphere, we utilize a broad set of tools, Symantec being a key partner of ours. And what we do is pull all the information out of various tool sets, put it into a single pane of glass so that you have one place to look to see what's happening within your environment. Steve, if you want to take on the rest of that with the technical integration between Symantec DLP solution and a data classification solution.
Sure. As I mentioned before, I mean, what we do is we do classification, tagging, labeling, and watermarking. And you can configure basically any DLP solution to do a certain action based on those classifications, tagging, labeling, and watermarking as well.
Excellent. And now we have room just for one final question, unfortunately, but please keep them coming in, and we'll be sure to get answers for all of them and then email them out to the audience. Last question is, I've read data classification should be done manually by a subject matter expert. Seems like a tall order to automate. It is a little bit of a tall order to automate, absolutely. But when you really dive down deep into your data, whether it exists on-prem or in the cloud, understanding the use case for that data, understanding the owners and data stewards for that data, you can begin applying some general, role-based intelligence to the data and begin applying classification. I believe Vijay mentioned in his presentation, that's a good place to start. Start slow, understand what's happening with the data, and build out your controls over time. So while deployment of a tool such as the Watchful Software RightsWatch solution isn't going to get you there on day one, it is an evolutionary process. Vijay, do you have something to add to that?
I think you summarized this right about the point there. The biggest challenge, both from experience and what I've observed, is right-sizing your implementation and understanding your data lifecycle model. Getting a DLP just because it's the right thing to do never seems to work. The failure rate of DLP solutions is as good as a slice of bread, but the effectiveness, if done correctly for the organization's requirement, any form of DLP can prove absolutely phenomenal. And I definitely see tremendous value anytime any type of transaction is done, either in line or directly from an email perspective. We always seem to at least have the ability to see transparently what's happening within the environment.
Fantastic. And Steve, what about from your perspective, where you're rolling your solution out to customers? What's your view on that question?
Like I mentioned before, in the real world, most people start out with the crawl, walk, run type scenario. Most of our customers have, where at first they will just start classifying. classifying data. And I think, as Vijay mentioned, I mean, that's one of the most important things to help you make a DLP strategy successful. The first thing you really have to do is, classify your data. I always say, all data isn't created equal. So once your data is classified, then you can decide which other aspects you're going to do with that, whether you're going to enforce certain policies and that. But I hope that answers it.
Great. No, thank you very much. All right. Well, it looks like we're at time now. It looks like we may have gone a minute or two over. So thank you, everyone, for sticking around. As I mentioned, there are some additional questions that have come in. We'll make sure those are answered and sent out to those asking. And again, if there's any other questions that you think of after this session, please feel free to reach out to myself, Vijay, or Steve, and we'd be more than happy to talk about what you have on your mind. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.